What are the 50s like?
My dad told me I should be very happy to be earning $100 a week, $125 a week, and to have a house one day in Long Island, and maybe a job at the bank. He was half kidding, but he was also serious that he was concerned about security, my security. He used to say, "Nobody gets out of here alive," which was later paraphrased by Jim Morrison. He used to say, "Life is no bowl of cherries." When he got out of college in 1931, his most vivid and dramatic memory was, with a Yale education, was turning out as a floor walker, begging for a job as a floor walker at a department store. So it took him a long while to get his feet after college. And I think that profoundly affected him. And he used to tell me that America did not come out of that depression until the Second World War, and that he, being a Roosevelt hater, used to say that Roosevelt got all the credit for getting America out of the Depression when, in fact, the war did. So I grew up in a environment of strict conformity, where I used to wear a tie and a shirt and a jacket every day. I lived in New York City. I did not go out on the street without a tie on. You felt naked on the street without a tie in the neighborhoods where I was. On the other hand, life had a very defined stability to it. Everything was done at a certain hour. My father would sit in the bathtub at a certain hour, and I could always go and see him at that hour and talk to him. In the 1950s, it was fear and conformity in getting good grades in school and trying to grow up without getting into too much trouble, you know? I think smoking cigarettes and maybe being a JD, a juvenile delinquent, was about the level of nonconformity that you could go to. You'd always be terrified of the kids that got kicked out of school, you know, because there'd always be those kids, 2 or 3 of your friends would go, and God, what's going to happen to him, you know? What's going to happen to his life now that he's gone, you know? A sense of conformity. Am I growing to Yale University in order to turn into another tie and a suit on Wall Street, to be a banker, to be another member of Skull and Bones or the CIA? You know, I mean, am I going to be part of that assembly line of American leaders and lawyers and white-collar people? And I looked at them. I saw the result through my father. I used to go to Washington and New York and see the result of the system, and I think I was questioning it. I wasn't sure what I could replace it with, but there was certainly a questioning going on. I think, you know, I went to Nam as a soldier eventually in 67, 8, and I saw things that just shocked me, opened my eyes. I'd never be the same again. Combat is a searing experience and devastating to what your sense of life is worth and your sense of self. You have no illusions about yourself or what life comes down to. It comes to a very basic thing: survival and killing. And you see a lot of ugliness in your fellow man and young people. I mean, it's a very genetic kind of thing. It just is breeded. It's an inbred thing. I try to deal with that in Platoon, where at the lowest level you see a certain type of man that's going to go a certain kind of way in a pressure situation. And other types of men are going to do better things, I think, morally better. So I got an eyeful of that about 19 and 20. I came back, and I guess I was like the Tom Cruise character in Bourne, in that I was not ready to condemn the war effort, but I certainly, things were not working in sync. My head and my heart were telling me two different things. My head was saying, yes, support the government, support the troops, support your flag. And my heart, my body language is telling me something was wrong over there. I don't believe what I saw. I don't think we were doing the right thing. I think we were hurting people. And I think that we were hurting ourselves a lot. And so I came back to a very conflicted inner state, and I went through years of questioning and alienation and doubts and personal problems. I went to jail at one point in America, 10 days after I got back from the Vietnam War, for marijuana, which was another eye-opener, because here in the jails I saw another underclass of kids that I just left in Vietnam that were in jail without any really hopes of freedom. I was lucky enough to end up at film school and got the GI Bill and made short films, and that, in a sense, took some of the pressure off of me that, you know, so many Vietnam veterans have been screwed up, as you know. Maybe, you know, they say, I don't know the numbers, but, you know, maybe more than 60,000 have died since the war, in addition to the 60,000 dead over there. We're talking about suicides, we're talking about alcohol-related car accidents and drug-related accidents. We're talking about despair and symptoms of syndromes of distress. I remember a very distinct demarcation point in 1968 when we were over, I was in the 1st Cavalry Division up north in Camp Evans. It was the day that Lyndon Johnson declared that he was not going to run for president. You knew, all the infantry line troops knew, it was because you couldn't con them, that we were not going to go out and win this war, that we were going to be fighting a retreating action as infantry from that point on. And from that point on, for a man to risk his life in a retreating action, it becomes highly doubtful that he will risk his life. Whereas before March of '68, there was still this sort of blind or naive belief that, you know, we were at least going to try to win this thing and take some territory and sort of close it and close it out. But after March of '68, there was no sense of definition. It was you fly into a piece of land, you'd lose men, you'd secure it, you'd leave it again, and then we went back to the same piece of land a few days later, and then you'd lose more men. The morale just went out. I noticed the drug taking went up in '68 considerably. Grass, heroin. That was a real major point. And then, of course, I think it was April. I think when King was shot in April. You sensed it immediately on the front lines with the black troops that there was a lot of hostility and anger. And again, that added to the demoralization. And then, of course, when Robert Kennedy was shot, that was like the final straw that broke the back of this thing. There was no hope after that of winning. It was just get out, count your days, and get out, you know, if you can, don't risk your life, don't take any foolish risks. And the officers, of course, could not rally the men to do anything beyond the minimum. I remember a very distinct demarcation point in 1968 when we were over, I was in the 1st Cavalry Division up north in Camp Evans. It was the day that Lyndon Johnson declared that he was not going to run for president. You knew, all the infantry line troops knew, it was because you couldn't con them, that we were not going to go out and win this war, that we were going to be fighting a retreating action as infantry from that point on. And from that point on, for a man to risk his life in a retreating action, it becomes highly doubtful that he will risk his life. Whereas before March of '68, there was still this sort of blind or naive belief that, you know, we were at least going to try to win this thing and take some territory and sort of close it and close it out. But after March of '68, there was no sense of definition. It was you fly into a piece of land, you'd lose men, you'd secure it, you'd leave it again, and then we went back to the same piece of land a few days later, and then you'd lose more men. The morale just went out. I noticed the drug taking went up in '68 considerably. Grass, heroin. That was a real major point. And then, of course, I think it was April. I think when King was shot in April. You sensed it immediately on the front lines with the black troops that there was a lot of hostility and anger. And again, that added to the demoralization. And then, of course, when Robert Kennedy was shot, that was like the final straw that broke the back of this thing. There was no hope after that of winning. It was just get out, count your days, and get out, you know, if you can, don't risk your life, don't take any foolish risks. And the officers, of course, could not rally the men to do anything beyond the minimum. Well, I think the America I came back to, in a sense, had changed enormously. I think that President Johnson split the country in half by sending only the poor kids to fight. The draft was not just. If you could get a college deferment, you got one. So that means the middle class avoided the war. If you had the money to pay a psychiatrist, you could get a psychiatric discharge. I mean, anybody could get out if they really wanted to. You cannot fight a war that way because it splits the generation. You're sending half the kids to go, and the other half are continuing on into commercial life here. I came back to a situation where my generation, the kids I knew, were all prospering. Because Johnson, in that war period, the inflation took this country like a steamroller and just shot up the value of the dollar. I mean, what a dollar could buy in '65 and what it could buy in '68 was tremendously different. And inflation was raging. People were making money. My friends were doing well. I came back to a situation where I was not encountering hostility to my involvement over there. I was encountering complete indifference. It was like, oh, you were over there? You dropped out for a year to go over there? What a waste of time. It's too bad. Welcome back. Let's get on with your life. But you can't just come back and get back into that beat. You're off a beat when you come back from war. You're off a beat, and you just don't look at people the same way. You don't relate to them the same way. You don't have friends. You don't have friends, and you don't trust your family because your family doesn't get it. My dad never got Vietnam. He thought it was a police action. I remember he told me. I'd been wounded twice, and he said, well, that's not really a war like the war I was in. And he said, it was a police action, which hurt me. You don't trust anybody. And then eventually you get to the point where you don't trust your government anymore. The Pentagon Papers came out. It was disgusting what was in those papers. The whole, Johnson fabricated the whole Vietnam War with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. They stampeded the Senate and the House into a war that was never declared. He sends half the country to fight it. He lets the rich go. It's a completely insane way. You're dividing the country. You're putting civil war into the country. He did what Lincoln did 100 years before, but he did it for the wrong reasons. Johnson made a civil war in this country. Given all those factors, I'm amazed it took me so long to realize what the hell was going on. I guess I'm stupider or slower or later developer than the rest. But I guess it took me to about 1971 to kind of say, hey, something is very wrong. The government is telling a lie. The government is a lie. Never trust your government again, blindly. 71, 72, and then of course Watergate happened in 72, and Mr. Nixon ends up to be another con man and a liar. I mean, so many times Nixon lied, you can't even count. But I still think Johnson outdoes Nixon in terms of lying. Johnson's years were longer.
Did you have any identification with what we call the counterculture?
It had no meaning to me until I heard some of the music in Vietnam. I heard the Chambers Brothers, and I heard the Doors. I heard the Beatles. I'd grown up, as I told you earlier, in a more conformist society in the 50s and the early 60s, where you wore a tie and a shirt. To suddenly see girls and boys completely naked, taking their clothes off, or even wearing these outrageous clothes, was quite a shock to me. And I said, how did they, I'd never have the courage to do that. I would never look to try to stand out in a crowd, with long hair. My father had always sort of taught me, a man, a woman should stand out, should look good, but a man should never stand out. He should be anonymous. Which is part of the reason you go to the army, to sort of be anonymous, to sort of not have an identity, to be part of a social fabric. There's a strange strength in that, to be one of a group, a collective, which I suppose is true about some of the hippie movement too. In their own way, they were joining a collective and being anonymous in their own way. But it struck me as very, at that time, it struck me as very individualistic, and I said I never understood the motivation. Now, the girls were very pretty, and the old thing about at that point in time, some of the girls were saying that we would never have sex with soldiers because they're the war machine, and they were going to deny sex to the military, and that was an interesting, I thought, concept of sort of lysistrata, and in fact they were right. I mean, if all the mothers in America had declared war on the Pentagon, and they could have prevented it. If all the mothers had spoken out as mothers to protect their sons, it would not have happened the way it did. The hippies, to me, I came to understand after the war what they were. the music that got me first. The music was, the black music is what worked. Because there was a lot of black troops in Vietnam, so they were playing Temptations and Smokey Robinson and stuff you saw in Platoon, you know, and that gets to your unconscious very quickly. It's interesting, that dichotomy in Vietnam between the guys who listened to country music, of which there were many. They had a very I would say a more hawkish point of view, whereas those boys who listened more to the soul music had a different point of view, and there was more like, hey man, I'm just going to take the Cassius Clay attitude, the Muhammad Ali attitude of, I got no beef with the Viet Cong. I'm going to get out of here. They were cooler, and we went through the villages. I found that those type of people would treat the villagers a little better than some of the people who listened to some of the country music who'd kick some ass. I think the music got to me first, the spirit of intoxication. And when I came back to the States, I started to do more and more grass. So of course, you know, the grass mellows you out, and you start to be less rigid in your thinking, less judgmental. You don't see categories the same way. I became much more tolerant, and I think what was nice about the hippie movement to me in those years was the sense of there was no fear. They really didn't operate out of fear like I did in Vietnam. I mean, I had to lose that fear. There was no sense of danger to life. There was no dealing with death. It was everything was there to be had. It was abundant. The world was in abundance. The world was to be loved. The concept of love is a public phenomenon. The mention of love in a public way, be outside of the church. This was the first I heard of it. You know, love, peace, man. You know, love and peace. That was the refrain. The concept was that life was there to be experienced fully, to experience everything. Have no fear, make no plans, make no career plans. Test and enjoy the limits of life.
Sounds pretty good.
It's hard for a Vietnam veteran to come back to that situation because you're racked with fear, you're racked with paranoia, with death on your mind. For me to make that transition to seeing Hair, the musical, or Jesus Christ Superstar, and trying to relate to that generation, my generation, was very difficult, and I never felt like I was with them. I could never be a hippie. Just there was a gulf, but that doesn't to say that I didn't smoke as much dope as they ever did, or take as many acid trips, because I did, and I had my own series of experiences, but I never considered myself in the mainstream of the hippie movement.
Where were you at the beginning of the 60s, and where had you come by the end of the 60s?
You're talking about adolescence. I think everything happens that's exciting in our lives from the age of probably 14 to 24, you know. That's the playground where so much is decided. I came from being a Republican, young Republican type conformist, not really knowing what I was thinking or why I was thinking it, but parodying sort of a party line, to being a anarchic, creatively anarchic, independent, free thinker, doubting everything by the end of the 60s, doubting the systems that I had learned about in the 50s, but not yet knowing how to live my life quite, and wrestling with many doubts and much internal warfare. You see, I don't ascribe to the media aspect of the 60s being this defined era. It's about our generation in the sense that we were born in the 40s, and it's a process that's been ongoing. So the 60s just melted in the 70s, the 70s and the 80s, and now into the 90s. But we're accumulating, we're absorbing all that information still, and we're reflecting back now some of our 60s values. They didn't disappear. There was no dramatic bombing of an airport that ended the 60s. I don't ascribe to Altamont being the end of the 60s, because there was some fighting and ugliness, and people were taking too many drugs, and there's no question that, abuse and self-indulgence did set in. But that didn't make drugs bad. Drugs were, people forget in this simplistic times that drugs were there to expand our minds And we took them to expand our minds. And in many cases, it worked. Our minds did get a little better. We started something. We questioned things. And we must never say that it was a loss or a failure or that it stopped. I see it as an ongoing phenomena. I would not be the person I am if it hadn't been for the 60s. And I'm still using that information in the 90s. And I hope, among other things, not only to celebrate the 60s with this movie, but to pass on, like DNA, some of that information to the kids that are growing up in the 90s. They should have it. It was a good time. It was a time when we were not scared. It was a time when we believed in the possibility of all things. We believed in love as a concept. We believed in experiencing all of life. And that innocence is wonderful and should always be there. It should not just disappear with age, and we mustn't become world weary. We become tired as we get older. We become more jaded. Yes, that's a part of life too. But threaded in there, it should be that innocence.
Is America a better place because of the 60s, Oliver?
Of course it is. Of course it is. 60s were good for America. Let off some of the pressure cooker that existed. That conformity was dangerous. That Cold War conformity. The 60s really started to question these things, brought it out into the open, and raised the possibility of hope and change and youth taking over the country and changing the mores and the standards of the country. Yeah, it was a very good time. And as I said, it's hardly over. It's still in us, and it's coursing through our veins right now, psychically. As our generation is coming to power now. The 60s generation is coming to power, and the good people have not forgotten what the 60s promised.